Welcome to the most recent episode of the Akkad and Coca Report. Today we have the pleasure of having Vinayak Prasad on. Vinayak is an he's a hematologist, he's an oncologist, he's an associate professor of medicine. He was recently at the Oregon Health and Science University School of Medicine, and just this summer, the year of the pandemic, moved to the University of California at San Francisco.
Yeah.
Dr. Prasad is tremendously prolific, writes about a number of different things. He has really used social media in the last 4 or 5 years to really, drive a lot of different discussion points. He's a critic on many different things. He really focuses a lot on research, the process of research, and of course, since he's an oncologist, he focuses a lot on cancer research. He's also written multiple books. His first book that I recall reviewing in a Twitter book club years ago was "Ending Medical Reversal." That was co-authored with Dr. Adam Cifu, a
Friend of the show.
Yep, a professor of at Chicago. And his most recent book is "Malignant: How Bad Evidence and Bad Policy Harms People with Cancer." He's been featured on multiple podcasts talking about it, including Russ Roberts as well. So anyway, we're very, very pleased to be able to have Vinay on. So Vinay, thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for the invitation. It's a pleasure to join you.
So Vinay, we wanted, we brought you on partly because you tweeted recently about the inability, it seems like, to be able to have conversations across the ideological spectrum. I'm paraphrasing you.
No, you're right. I think that's fair. Yeah. And I think, we'll probably agree a lot on this. Yeah.
Well, so what has happened? Do you think that has resulted in kind of like this narrowing of the Overton window, if you will, that that doesn't allow for conversations to happen? And when was it that you kind of noticed it, or have you kind of noticed it the entire time?
Yeah, that's so I certainly haven't noticed it until very recently. I think the three of us, I see Michelle is joining us, and but the three of us have been on Twitter, and so many people have been on Twitter for, I guess, for me, like 5-6 years. And I think there has been a shift, I think, over the course of the last 2-3 years, where it has been increasingly difficult for people who don't agree 100% on every issue to be able to engage. I think it's hard for me to even describe it because it just makes me think that we've all gone mad. But I mean, my premises are simple. One, even people you love and work hand in glove with and you get along all the time, you're not going to agree on everything. You talked about one of the books I've written with Adam Cifu. He and I are good friends, colleagues, collaborators. He's been my mentor. We don't agree on everything. That's okay. We're still friends. We can still get along. We still have a conversation. We can still meet in the middle where we meet in the middle. But I think there has been a growing trend, especially on Twitter, where folks want to silence or eliminate views that they disagree with. And I guess I would say that I'm not even against that in all circumstances. I do think that there are some really poisonous fringe views that it's okay to say, we're not going to engage with those views. They're just so crazy. We're not even going to discuss it or engage, and we're going to be like, stay distance. But when people who are part of the academy, part of the community of medical doctors, and in good faith have slightly different views than you do, well within sort of the central, 75% of human beings, I think it is bad not to engage with them. It's bad not to strike up a conversation. We can still disagree at the end of the day. It doesn't mean that you have to agree with them, but to really want to build a wall from those ideas, I think that's what we're seeing. And we're seeing it a lot, I think, on the far left and far left med Twitter. And I say that as somebody who is on the political left. That's what, you and I, this is where we differ a little bit. But, I am on the political left. I would put myself very close to Elizabeth Warren in terms of political philosophy. And yet I'm still concerned by what I view as the far left choosing to silence people.
It's so interesting because I kind of, you're talking about, I think you're referencing what happened with John Ioannidis.
Among many things. Sure. That's one. Yeah. Let's start there. Yeah.
Right. And it's funny, it's been relatively obvious to me as somebody who has kind of moved from one side of the spectrum towards another side of the spectrum, that what's acceptable conversation among my medical colleagues, whether it be in real life, certainly in real life, or in Twitter, has become more challenging. That's been obvious to me for years and years and years.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
when I started coming out against certain policies related to the Affordable Care Act, and it
Sure.
wasn't working, and I'm pushing to try to change it, and suddenly, people just turn off. It's like if I say that I'm not supporting the ACA, it's like, oh my God, you must want to,
You're not on the team. You're
you're
off
not,
the team.
yeah,
And you're
not
not on
just
the team. We don't have to talk to you.
right, and you're not, and you're almost, it's immoral. You
Yeah.
want to kill grandma. You don't care about people with pre-existing conditions. Anyway, this isn't to talk about the ACA,
I,
but it's funny. It's funny to me that, or not funny. It's interesting that, I kind of, observing. You're very, very, like I said, prolific, and you tweet a lot, and it's interesting that some folks, kind of expanded, expanded their worldview, if you will, slightly, whereas others became even narrower and kind of doubled down. And that's kind of what I saw when Ioannidis came out, suggesting things that weren't what his team was saying. You were one of the few people that wasn't necessarily saying, "Hey,
yeah.
I'm on Team Ioannidis." What you were saying was exactly what you just said. That, hey, look, this is a very well-respected guy who's done a lot
Yeah.
of research, and he's a very thoughtful person. And I could sense that you were very concerned about the reaction that
Oh
he
yeah.
was that he was getting.
Yeah. No, that's a absolutely fair summary. I guess I would say, I mean, one thing is, I feel like I'm the same person I was 6 years ago. I feel like the whole of Twitter has moved in a different in a direction. So I do think that's how I feel on the inside. Whether that's true or not, that's
Yeah,
for others to decide. But let's talk about the John Ioannidis example.
yeah,
There's two parts to it. One, what he's actually saying, and to what degree different people may agree with that. Okay. The second part is, how should we react to someone saying that? And I guess I would say that I mean, we're talking more about the reaction. I'm really concerned with how people have reacted to him. Um, John Ioannidis, I think and somebody could try to prove me wrong on this, but I've never heard him say a political word for 20 years. He's been publishing all these academic papers. He's never supported any political candidate, to my knowledge, never on the left, never on the right. I think he's sort of been apolitical. I've
actually,
never
Vinay,
seen.
there's a laptop that he left in Delaware that is currently being analyzed, and there have been emails
with some emails on it.
emails discovered between him and Donald Trump.
Yeah, he
He
let
was
him
a
have that.
sleeper.
Yeah, of course he was the one who was responsible. Yeah, but you put it well. The way and so what happened? So in the heat of the moment in the pandemic in March, I remember how I felt. I was on Twitter a lot, which is a blessing and a curse. And when you're on Twitter a lot, you will be very afraid. And so I was fearful. I wondered who in my circle of family members, in my broad sort of extended family, who's going to die. I wondered, and I was scared. I think a lot of people were scared. And that sort of narrative is very addictive. It hits all the sort of metrics of the platform. It gets amplified a lot. John's not on the platform. He has nothing to do with it. He had a different view. I think his view was very early on. He was very concerned of the harms of the reaction. He, I think, was also concerned about the virus, of course, but maybe in his own mind that was slightly lower. And I guess what I want to say is, whether or not he's right or wrong, that to me, that's the irrelevant conversation, because that's a conversation nobody wanted to have. The conversation they wanted to have was, why is he saying this? Why is he talking? Why is he a part of this conversation? And systematically, over the course of several weeks, I think a large portion of his reputation was attacked, just really sort of trampled. And a lot of people chose and even said as much as, we don't have to take his work seriously. We don't have to engage with him. And that to me is a poisonous view. I mean, somebody said that, people like to say that, aren't there some views you won't engage with? I say, yeah, views that are like clearly wrong when we really know the right answer. But in the heat of the moment, when the uncertainty bounds are like, as wide as my, reach, to say you're not going to engage with somebody whose point of view is that we got to be more cautious about the downsides of what we're doing, that's crazy. I mean, that's just not in the spirit of free thinking and free thought. And I think, this is where you and I are going to see really eye to eye.
Do you think that part of the reason you felt that way when it came to Dr. Ioannidis is that he has been a ideological, somewhat of a mentor for you? The research that he has looked at in terms of conflict of interest and how it impacts, in terms of bias and its effects on conclusions, the financial aspects of it. So he's been a mentor to you in many ways. He seems to be we don't know his politics, but he seems to be a progressive. And
He seems
in
to be,
general,
right? I
yeah,
mean, no,
in
but people
general,
have called him a right wing. But I would say the one thing that goes
yeah,
against that is I felt the same way about Norman Wang, and I are not on the ideological spectrum.
right,
That's
right,
another instance where I was really concerned with the process. So, I mean, your point is fair. One
yeah,
of the things that concerned me was, it's very likely that my bias is that I have read this guy's work for many years. I'm very familiar with it. And probably, as anyone doing evidence-based medicine type research, we certainly owe a debt of gratitude to his work and probably do borrow some of his methods. So that's, I think, absolutely true. But I guess there were a couple of other instances very quickly that followed where people were on the opposite side of the spectrum, and I was just as concerned with how they were treated. So, I mean, but your point is fair. I mean, that might be part of my motivation in this case. Yeah.
So right, and by the way, that I was particular. That's exactly why that I was particularly impressed by your take on that affair. Dr. Wong is an electrophysiologist at the University of Pittsburgh. Wrote a white paper. Um,
Racist name for that paper, by the way.
right, exactly. I shouldn't say it. Wrote a non anyway. I wrote
Yeah,
a paper.
wrote a policy paper.
I don't even know what to say without getting into trouble.
I know.
Wrote some type of policy paper on affirmative
Policy
action.
paper, yeah.
It was relatively clear, of course, in this policy paper. There was kind of a descriptive history of affirmative action through the course of time since 1969 and how it affects medicine. It was relatively clear that he had a certain view. He was not pro affirmative action, and of course that paper was published in March in the midst of the pandemic. And in July or sorry, in August or whatnot, it was discovered, and there was a mob, both in his institute. Well, it seemed like in his institution as well as on Twitter, that kind of descended upon him and basically said that he was racist and this is terrible. And he was quickly relieved of duties as
removed from a position.
Yeah. He was. I mean, so
Yeah.
as program director of the EP Fellowship, he was taken away, and he's also not allowed to be in contact with any trainees after a long, distinguished career because he's establishing an unsafe environment. So trainees are not safe to work with him. So
and his paper was retracted against his consent. And let's also mention the time span this happened in. This wasn't a 7-week process. This was a 1-day process, 2 days, right? It happened within 2 days.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
So
incredible.
Yeah.
So incredible. Yeah. So it kind of stunned a lot of us, and you were one of the very few folks to actually come out publicly and support him.
Well,
certainly,
eventually,
more recently.
after I worked up the courage, because I was scared too.
Why were you scared? Why were you scared?
I think so many people are scared of talking openly about a number of issues where we are worried that they will be a Twitter pylon. I wrote another paper recently about mob Twitter, and I describe it as, and people say, well, it's not a mob. I was like, you know what? If somebody writes a paper, let's start with the Norman Wang example. How many people do you think read that paper before it got amplified? Let's be honest. I doubt it was less than 50 people. Right. I mean, I have, we've gathered sort of citation statistics, readership statistics. I doubt 50 people read that paper cover to cover. And a few of them were the editors who will never say who their names are, who actually probably agreed with him.
Yeah.
That's why it was published. A lot of people, some people agreed with him. That's why it was published. The other thing about his point of view, I want to say just up front, is I actually disagree with this guy. I mean, that's what I always come back to. I was like, I can't even forget for a minute. I disagree with this guy. I'm actually a believer that race should be allowed to be considered by universities. They have, and we could have that discussion, but you've covered it nicely on your other episodes. But I'm on the political left here. I'm a sort of a staunch advocate that these programs do have a value and ought to be pursued. But I would say Norman Wang is closest in my mind to, he's not Scalia. He's actually probably John Roberts. I think he's actually probably right where John Roberts is in terms of ideological view of affirmative action. I don't think John Roberts is a fan of it, and I think this court is going to move in that direction, especially with Coney Barrett. So let's put him in that context. He's not, I think, extreme fringe in either direction. He is really right of center where John Roberts is. I guess it took me a while to speak up about it, and I guess I was concerned, to answer your question, because there is a sort of feeding frenzy on Twitter. It's like blood in the water, and then the sharks come. And they come, many of them are faceless, nameless. Many of them have no reputation of their own. They don't say who they are. They add caustic, venomous comments. They up the ante. We can talk about the Med Bikini example. I think that's another example where I wondered, is their goal to get this 22-year-old first-year medical student to kill himself? I mean, I honestly wondered, because after 400 comments saying he's a misogynist and a hateful person, I would imagine that he might be prone to suicidality. And how would you feel if you were just adding fuel on the fire that led someone to commit suicide? And these things do happen. There are many sort of anecdotal examples of, people who are online bullied. And you can bully someone even if they're wrong and even if you disagree with them. It has to do with the magnitude of the response. And so those things concern me. I also think there's a separate issue here, which is this is, at the end of the day, it was published in JAHA, I don't know how good that journal is, but I think it's one of your top 10 journals in cardiology. Maybe you'll put a question mark there, but it is a peer-reviewed journal. It has a process. And if you think it's wrong, if you think that there are factually incorrect statements in that, if you think it meets the grounds for retraction, there has to be some process where that is vetted and evaluated by people. It just can't be that we've got a lot of things saying people don't like this article, we'll pull it immediately. There is a process, and I think that's why the DOE has investigating this claim, because I mean, I always thought as a liberal, one of the things it meant to be a liberal was I will defend the right of someone to say something that I disagree with. I thought that's part of the liberal philosophy, but these days that seems like it's gone, and that scares me.
Vinay, you talked about these nameless, faceless, mobs on Twitter, and that's true. There's a large part of it, but also there are actually very prominent people who participated, right? And from academia in particular, and it's Norman Wong is an academic, and it's an academic department that's going to be investigated.
Yes.
And Med Twitter, there's a large influence of academia on Med Twitter. I mean, it's become sort of and I don't want to put you on the spot. You hold an academic position, and I can I can understand that you're in a difficult position. But how do you view? I mean, are you concerned for academia in general?
Yes, of course.
Right.
I mean, I think you're hitting the nail on the head in a couple of ways. One, of all the people who condemned it, who were not nameless, do you think they all read it? From the nature of their comments, from the nature of the response, do you really think they read it? There are many people who commented on that who I sincerely doubt that they read that article. And I doubt that because they were unable to muster specific examples of falsehoods. They were unable to give the credible reasons why that met the criteria for retraction. They still have not yet published the rebuttal, which I thought would have gone hand in hand with the retraction to actually explain why it is retracted. I still don't understand that. I want to say, I guess a couple things. One, I actually would like to write the rebuttal to this article. I think I would do a good job of writing it. I think it would be quite persuasive as to why these programs ought to continue and why we do need diversity. But I am concerned with a movement that seeks to rip down the article before they've articulated the counter response. And I actually think it probably shouldn't have been retracted. It should have been rebutted. Actually, the correction, I actually think it should have been ignored. No one was going to read this article anyway, because no one reads 16-page white papers in cardiology journals. I mean, I think it really doesn't have much of a readership. And by putting a flag on it and saying this is a problem, and we can talk a little bit about that. I mean, I think that's part of this phenomenon, which is that there's some people out there looking for things to use as a fuse, to light something. And we have to be really careful. There are true injustices in this world, and we have to bring our attention to that. But if you go out of your way to find an injustice that you believe is a perceived injustice, I don't know if you make the world better or actually kind of secretly drive the injustice further, if you view this as an injustice. But to answer your question, long story short, I think academics who contributed to the withdrawal of this paper have a duty to provide a long, detailed rebuttal and publish that in an expeditious manner. Already, I think they have failed that duty because too much time has elapsed. It's already a problem. And I think they also had a duty to go through a process at the University of Pittsburgh, some sort of hearing or panel. And another example is Gil Welch. Gil Welch recently was involved in, you remember this example, whether or not he borrowed a figure from Dr. Soneji, which led to a sort of a punishment from Dartmouth. He resigned as a response to the punishment. The New England Journal had a slightly different view, but my understanding is that that was months and months of committee meetings before that was adjudicated. And this was another academic dispute. Academic disputes have to go through a process of adjudication. One of the virtues of adjudication, the simple virtue, is by having time go on, we all cool down a little bit. We cool down a little bit, and cooler heads can prevail, and maybe there is something here, a conversation that could be had.
It's interesting that the academics that were involved in actually relieving him of his duties and stuff felt that they needed to act in such a quick manner. It's almost like and these are folks that ostensibly have known him for a long time, because he's been at the University of Pittsburgh for a significant period of time. It's almost it speaks to some of the rot, if you will, that exists when it comes to some of these issues, because it's almost that if the chief of cardiology, say, or whoever it was that made that decision, I don't know who exactly made the decision, but whoever was above him administratively made that decision to relieve him. If they didn't do that, they were next on the list of the mob.
Yes, I think that's right.
Lynch and stuff. Do you think
That's
has this been instructive to you? I mean, Vinay, you've kind of stormed the ramparts, if you will, on social media in the last 5 years, and right. Do you feel that you've been guilty of kind of going after people on social media in a similar way? Like, has this kind of made you think twice about how you respond, say, to people that you disagree with?
That's a good question. So I guess I would say other things have made me recalibrate how I respond. The other things have made me recalibrate how I respond. And that's because in my response, I want to be more persuasive. I want to persuade the third party. That's my goal. And as you work on Twitter, as you spend time there, I think you develop a sense of what you want to, where you want to push, where you don't want to push, how far you want to go, how far you don't want to go. But I will say one distinction. I have never, and I will never, join a mob. What is a mob? I will never be the 200th comment to say that some article is stupid. If I look at something and I see 10 comments, I'm out. That's it. This person has been notified that there are people who don't like this article. I don't need to additionally notify them. And that, to me, is the failure of individual behavior. We can talk about the mob as sort of a collective entity. It's almost drunk on its own power. It doesn't know where to stop. It keeps pushing, as I described, maybe trying to push some kid to suicide. I mean, it feels that way as an observer. But I think the individual responsibility is, why are you the 52nd person saying that this is, whatever adjective you want to insert, even if you feel it is bad. And in my article about mob behavior, I say, take the number of followers someone has, divide by 100, and that's how many feedback comments they can get. So, if Norman Wang if somebody has 1,000 followers, they get 10 pieces of feedback, and then we all stop. There has to be some sort of limit on this, and I think so. I guess I would say your point is well taken. I think I'm happy to talk about how I've recalibrated, why I've recalibrated. But I do think that I have always been reluctant to participate in these sort of mob events. And the same with you guys. I don't see you guys participating in mob events either.
Yeah, there's that pull to do it. I feel it when I see something that isn't along my ideology. But the difficulty is, and I'm not perfect at doing this. The difficulty is
you still quote tweet, Anish.
Yes, no, I do.
Well, we all, but I guess we can throw a we all tweet, and we all have strong opinions. The three of us at least, and we all argue with each other, and we all get into arguments with many people. But we're talking about arguments where it's 7 versus 2. Right. 5 versus 7.
Right.
We're
but
not
also
1,000 to 1. We're not a part of that, because we're talking about stenting. We're talking about dual antiplatelet therapy. We're talking about cancer drugs. We're talking 7 to 2. That kind of dynamic. Right. That's much more fair. That's a fair fight. Also,
it's not. There isn't the danger that I think it doesn't feel like there isn't any the type of danger that exists in some of these other mobs which attach to people's livelihoods. So
I think that's fair.
That's the part where, fine, if you want to tag on and rip somebody because they think that, you think something that they said is idiotic. Okay. But one of the issues with some of these med Twitter mobs is that it results in real major problems in real life, meaning people losing their jobs, you're talking about. So, and that's where that's the part that's concerning. If it was the culture, and it's happened rarely, that the person at University X says, you know what, this person has said something that I find to be despicable, but he has the freedom to say it, and this is why I think he's wrong. And we are going to defend his freedom to say it. That's classic liberalism, as you say.
That's classic liberalism. That's classic liberalism.
That's channeling Noam Chomsky. Noam Chomsky today, right? Just the other day, I saw there's some young whatever person with who says, I have proved, they were discussing deplatforming, and Chomsky was very patiently, I mean, I love the way Noam Chomsky has been patiently explaining things to people for God knows how long, since William Buckley and whatnot. But he's patiently explaining to this 20-some-year-old person that deplatforming is probably not what you want to do. The right thing to do to somebody like Charles Murray, who you completely disagree with, is to rebut him. Very similar to what you're saying, and somehow. Somehow it's not just
or
that
ignore. I mean, I think in the case of Murray has gotten a lot of followers because they've chosen not to ignore. He could have been ignored easily. But just to two things that you said struck me. One, we will all agree there is something Norman Wang could have said that should have gotten him fired. There is such a thing. He could have said that thing. We don't want to go what that thing is, but he could have said something so bad that we like, oh my God, this guy's got to go. This is a crazy thing to say. Okay, He didn't say that. He said something that we disagree with, even passionately, even vociferously, but is held by, I would suspect, 40% of Americans hold that view, almost identical. I mean, and suspect the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and him are really, really close. So that level of saying something, that's got to be within the bounds of what we think is permissible and able to say. And then the second thing I would say is, I agree with you so much that efforts to punish someone at work, and somebody said, well, he didn't get fired, but he did lose the fellowship directorship. And that may have had some FTE component protection. So he may, in fact, actually have to scramble to get some funding for his job. That is a direct financial punishment for him. He's had a financial punishment. Somebody else could have been fired in some scenario. In the United States, if you fire someone, that's a death sentence. I mean, that's their health insurance gone. That's their family's health insurance gone. Their livelihood gone. I mean, this is a country that doesn't have a strong safety net, this is an area where we might disagree. But about whether or not we ought to have it. But because I think we ought to. But it's terrible. And I think liberals are supposed to be the kinds of people who are more cognizant of those types of punishments. They have a culture of criminal justice that is incredibly tolerant and redemptive. And yet in these cases, they have no tolerance and they have no compassion for somebody who disagrees with them.
Right. No, absolutely. And that's partly why we appreciate, it's appreciated so much, because it's almost that it's the community that has to kind of give some guidance to what is and is not acceptable. And the more and more it is that a small minority of folks define what is and is not acceptable. And they kind of cow everyone into silence.
I think
that's what kind of narrows that over the window. So that's why it's so important to have folks like you who are on the political left, who disagree with Norman Wang, who still say, hey, guys, we have this is something that is acceptable. He is, and the moment we start saying his views are utterly unacceptable, are racist or whatnot, we have a real big problem.
Let's talk about some other examples that I think people forget that if you think his view is unacceptable today, wait till your view is unacceptable tomorrow. That's what they forget. I have views on cancer screening that run counter to many people. I have views on how cancer drugs should be approved that run counter to many people. I believe I should have the freedom to try to persuade you that my views are right. And if you start saying that, and people have gone after me too. And so maybe that's why it's a little bit of a sensitive spot, because I know what it's like when people call your boss, ask that you be fired and all these kinds of things for views that are within a range of acceptable views, I believe. And, it doesn't mean you have to agree with me on everything. It just means that you think you can win the war of ideas. Let me have a role in that war of ideas. If this is a war of ideas, that's the other thing. I mean, we can talk about the separate thing is if you really want to persuade people that Norman Wang is wrong, all of this theater and punishing him has distracted from the conversation about why he was wrong. And in fact, none of these people who are so critical of him have really put forth a long, thoughtful piece on why he is wrong. That's the missing of the element from this whole thing.
Right. No, it's, I mean, it's been relatively clear that it's more just appealing to some type of tribal mentality rather than some type of thoughtful rebuttal, which there exists. I mean, that's the thing. We acknowledge that there are multiple. These are complex, nuanced topics. The solutions to some of these problems that we're talking about are not easy, and certainly there's going to be different people with different lived experiences, some different ideologies are going to have different approaches to it. Getting to are we allowed to disagree with you, Dr. Prasad, on
Please,
some matters? What
let's do it.
um I first heard of you with the book you read about ending medical reversals. Um and you've a lot of your the research work that you've done certainly earlier on and you continue to do relates to this idea that um, a lot of what we do is not based on solid evidence, and that we can do much better, and doing much better involves a solid foundation of EBM, and that involves doing randomized controlled trials. Is that a fair representation of what you're so?
Yeah, I guess the only thing I would add is, because I guess I have a little bit of a sense of where you two come from.
Yeah.
But I'd love to learn a little bit more. But I think the one thing that I want to kind of talk about is, for me, one of the questions in medicine is who pays. So if we have a medical system, which I think is a system that I hear Michelle talk about from time to time, a medical system where every person individually finds their doctor and chooses what to pay for, then I think I am much more comfortable accepting people who are choosing whatever levels of evidence that they so desire for the choices they want to make. They're all paying individually, and that's the kind of model we have. But if we start having a world where many of us are going to be taxed, and we're going to take all that tax money and we're going to say, we're taking this money to give you something that will benefit everybody, and we're going to subsidize employer-based insurance, we're going to subsidize Medicaid and Medicare and all these things, we're going to have these benefits, then I think the services that we offer have to have credible data that as they are provided, they improve outcomes for people to whom they're provided. And if they don't have that credible data, then I think you lose that moral authority to take everyone's tax money and give it to people to pay for things that don't work. So I think that's, I guess, part of my philosophy of how we should have evidence and evaluate it is predicated on the fact that we use this by fiat, collect money from people, which I actually think is a good thing, but it can only be used to pay for things that actually offer net benefit. Otherwise, it's just sort of a deranged capital redistribution scheme that's probably actually regressive in nature, I would think.
But irrespective of, there are 2 points. Yes. Irrespective of who pays, are we able to evaluate? We are able to evaluate evidence to decide. All right, is there not efficacy? Correct. I mean, those two are.
I believe that's true, but I also
divorced.
think that, but who pays does matter, because, for instance, if you're buying a house and you decide you want whatever marble countertop on your thing, it's really none of my business. I can't tell you that's better or worse. And what if I did a study and I said, in a randomized trial of quartz countertops versus marble countertops are 4 times more likely to stain. Well, you know what? If you still want to buy a marble countertop, it's your business, you know? So I guess I really do think my sort of scope of philosophy is predicated on the fact that we are using people's revenue in a different way. That said, if you did do the randomized trial and I showed it to you and I say, whatever, quartz countertops are better than marble countertops, don't you want to do this? Maybe you should, as a rational person, choose a quartz countertop. I don't know, but I guess you see the distinction I'm trying to make.
I see what you're saying. But the second point, so if it's on your dime, hey, you necessarily want your bar of evidence, because hey, I'm helping pay for this. But of course, the cancer moonshot, we all love moonshots.
Yeah.
That started with Nixon, right? Who basically
the original cancer moonshot.
Yeah. Yes. Have we ended? Has that worked? How's that working?
The war on cancer. Yeah.
The war on cancer.
Yeah. It's like the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan just keep going. Yeah.
But part of that contract was that you were taking this.
Yeah.
What was a significant amount of money at the time, which has been dwarfed now, right?
Yes.
But the point, I mean, the reason we got the public to give money to fund all this research was to end cancer. So is there not some responsibility on the part of those who are getting that money not to have too high of a bar, because if you create too high of a bar to then ostensibly there are trade-offs in terms of progress, correct? Meaning you could, based on where you draw your line, or where you put your fence or whatnot, not be eliminating drugs that possibly are having a benefit, right? So there are, there's, it's not so easy, correct?
Well, it's not so easy. That's true. But I guess I would say, but I'm not so worried that they're putting the bar in a place they're losing out on good drugs. But I guess I would say there are two parts to, I mean, what you're talking about. There is a social contract when they declared war on cancer, and we're going to cure cancer and take all this taxpayer money. Part of the social contract is not to overpromise. They promise the moon every time. Every time they have these cancer things, they promise ridiculous things that cannot happen. We're gonna, and even philanthropic, what was that philanthropic initiative? We're gonna cure all diseases by 2030 or whatever, 2020. They all have these ridiculous promises. So I think scientists are bred to overpromise. I've read a lot of grants recently, some grants we're working on. It's ridiculous. It's just a bunch of, can I swear on this podcast? It's a bunch of bullshit. Yeah, okay. It's a bunch of bullshit in these grants. I mean, everyone knows it is. The people who write it, you ask him like, dude, you can't do this. This is ridiculous. And he's like, yeah, I know. I just have to sell it. I mean, it's a ridiculous game. And so I put a big fault on the researchers and for overpromising in an effort to get more money for whatever pet project they want. And then they cannot deliver because it's almost too difficult a biological task.
So one of the issues we'll come back to cancer in a minute.
Sure.
One of the issues that I had when in reading some of your initial work was that it just seems it seems how do I put it? Again, not to be insulting at all. It just feels like the path that progress takes. Is these tiny little increments that are difficult to discern initially, and then when you look back over 10 years, you then get a much clearer picture of what's going on. For instance, you've mentioned in one of your great articles in the Mayo Clinic proceedings. This is when you were a fellow. I even watched your video. I was like, my God, here's baby-faced Vinay. Mayo Clinic proceedings. This will be on the show notes for everyone to watch Vinay's video when he was a senior chief fellow. But
7 years ago.
Yeah. You still have a baby face. A decade of reversal, an analysis of 146 contradicted medical practices.
Yeah.
And one of the papers you talked about is the AFFIRM trial, right? And
rate versus rhythm. Yes.
So the AFFIRM trial analyzed rate versus rhythm control, and
I'm out of practice, but rate versus rhythm.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm with you. Yeah.
And so this idea was, that there was, we have all these drugs which we use as antiarrhythmics, and cardiologists with their white coats and with their air of certainty, which must have no doubt annoyed many an oncologist or many a resident. Who, the residents are like, what the heck? I like this guy's in this or that. And, the attending comes in, and they cycle through all these different complicated sounding antiarrhythmics. And some of the time they're in rate control. Some of the time they're rhythm controlled. And again, we're in the hospital. So, most of the time we end up seeing all these failures of people and are like, what the heck are we doing? We're cardioverting this person for 70 times.
Yes.
Anyway,
you put them on flecainide, dofetilide, you put them on all these drugs, you cardiovert them, you dofetilide load them, you bring them in for a week, dofetilide load them, you cardiovert them, and then they go back into AFib as soon as they go out. So, I mean, okay. But sometimes they feel better or some people claim, anecdotally, because some people claim.
But there's been this general idea that cardiologists have had that, we just like sinus rhythm.
You like sinus, of course.
Let's try to restore
natural rhythm.
Rhythm, right? And so in light of this, of course, and there's skeptics, and again, randomized controlled trials come from a base of skepticism, right? I mean, the reason the initial IMA, the Lima, the IMA ligation trials for
the Cobb study,
the famous Cobb study that you know well.
That used to know. It's been a long time since I looked at that, but go on. Yeah. I see what you're getting.
The reason that RCT was done was that it was grounded in a place of skepticism, right? So that's one point in that there are folks that are skeptical and by whatever, and then they do that trial. So there's of course a bioplausibility that's built into that. But in the AFFIRM, when it comes to AFFIRM, for instance, right? So they did a rate versus rhythm control study. and of course, the results were resoundingly negative, and that's why you listed it as one of the important reversals, right?
Yes.
It was a reversal of
and
standard
it did,
medical practice.
and it changed practice. I mean, it changed a lot of people's behavior.
Right,
You agree?
right.
Okay.
Yeah, no, it certainly did. It's, and again, I grew up in that age, and I was like,
in
yeah,
the post-affirm age.
Right. Screw rhythm control. Like, how many patients have I said, the important thing is rate control. Unless you're very symptomatic, then blah blah. So I've been so rate control.
Sure.
In large part based on affirm, and the issue was that, and actually there was a trend towards more mortality and stroke in the rhythm control arm. So that was the thinking when you were writing. And does that mean we as cardiologists should have abandoned a rhythm control strategy? But of course, folks that have a broad experience base that treat patients all the time, kind of, and this is what happens, by the way. And I'm just picking affirm as one example, but this is what happens in multiple different things. So, what if I were to tell you that an analysis of the patients in affirm, those in normal sinus rhythm, in a post-hoc analysis, the presence of sinus rhythm was significantly associated with a lower risk of death, some hazard ratio of like 0.5.
I would say it's a per protocol. It's got a big problem. It's per protocol, problem.
Yep.
Because the people whose atria are still able to be flipped back into sinus are different than the people's atria are just exploded out and you can't get them back in sinus no matter what you did, right?
Right. No,
okay.
Right. No, exactly right. So, so you're right. That is only hypothesis generating, right?
Sure.
It's like, well, here's affirm. It showed failure, but the issue is that the prevalence of sinus rhythm, at 5 years follow-up, the prevalence of sinus rhythm in the rhythm control arm is only 63%. As time progresses, we develop different rhythm control strategies, right? Now we have ablation. Now we say, the other problem was that we also used to believe at the same time that if you were rhythm controlled, we could take you off of anticoagulation. So that's why there were more strokes seen in the rhythm control arm. So anyway, there's all these complexities that come out, and then a number of other trials end up being done.
Of course,
there's the CASTLE-AF trial that is done looking at patients with LV dysfunction, and they look at ablation versus whatnot.
And what Cabana's the other one?
Right, and
which one is the one with the effect size that's like so massive that I can fit a school bus in that to Kaplan-Meier? Which one is that one?
I think that's CASTLE-AF. That's
CASTLE-AF.
With LV.
CASTLE-AF is a massive effect size. Yeah,
right. There were 300. I think that's one. 363 patients, 16% absolute risk reduction in death hospitalization. So
home run.
So that's done, but that's looking at folks with LV dysfunction, right?
Yes.
And saying, all right, so now we've established that maybe in sick patients who have heart failure, we can perhaps get endpoint reductions. But I got some questions about that trial, but I'll come back to that. But also in Affirm, did they exclude LV dysfunction? I forget. They did not. I don't think they. That's a good question. I'm forgetting. I don't think they excluded. I think they excluded. I think there was a small percentage of people that had it. So I'm sorry, I'm taking some time to get to my point. But as time progresses, this has now been 10 or whatever years since this happens. The most recent trial that was done, right? There's again this open question about if you are more successful at doing rhythm control with antiarrhythmics that aren't as toxic, or with ablation, which involves no drugs,
can you be better than rate control?
And if you keep people on anticoagulation, which is a lot easier now because we have these direct oral anticoagulants, which isn't Coumadin, because now we know that even if you have some little bit of AFib, you can have strokes, then maybe you can have benefit. And guess what? There's you said Cabana, there's CASTLE-AF, then that building towards this most recent.
Wait, Cabana was negative or positive? I thought Cabana was negative. No, so I haven't kept up.
No, Cabana. So Cabana was right. So Cabana, no benefit of hard endpoints. You're right. Right. Okay. But the most recent trial is the East AF Net trial. Which is this European trial in 2,700 patients, and in this, and again, these were minimally symptomatic patients, captured early on, and they did again a rhythm versus rate control strategy, and learning from Affirm, they said, you know what, we're only going to take patients that are relatively new onset of AFib, and we're going to do a rhythm versus rate control, because we think maybe part of the reason Affirm failed was they were using patients that were in AFib for 20 years, and then you try rhythm versus rate control, and you run into problems. By the way, we're not going to take anyone off of anticoagulation unless they're bleeding or something. So 90% of people end up staying on AFib. And guess what? the East AFNet trial, is a positive trial. So
What's the sample size?
it is 2,800 patients.
Okay, decent, good. Okay,
So
okay.
and again, I'm not.
I'm going to tell you how I would view this whole world. I mean,
right. So
I guess, yeah.
the point, I'm not trying to pimp you on the freaking on the trial, and and every random RCT has limitations to it. So does this.
Yeah, sure.
And we're still evolving. But that's the point. My point is not. The point is that is it right necessarily to take a point in time like you did
right
when you were a fellow and say, affirm, aha, we have a reversal, when 8 years or whatever, 10 years from affirm, now that we've learned more, we've selected based on understanding and learning and making these hypotheses based on whatever.
Right. Here's how I would put it.
Yeah.
I would say the question in this space, and again, I'm not a cardiologist and I haven't looked at this literature in a while. I only follow Mandrola's podcast a little bit to keep me abreast of what you guys are doing. Yeah. And you got so many new catheters and so many things I can hardly keep up. And I got too many drugs in my own space to remember. Okay, but anyway, here's the way I would view it. I think the question that you have always had, that has long existed, is I would say this, and maybe you will disagree with me, but I would say the less aggressive thing to do for someone with AFib is merely to rate control them and anticoagulate them. That's less aggressive. It takes less effort. Mm-hmm. It's probably fewer pills. There's less monitoring. It's less costly, and it's probably just less effort. The more aggressive strategy is to use some combination of chemical drugs, catheter, pacing wires, whatever you want, to try to put them back into sinus rhythm. That's the more sort of invasive, complicated strategy. And I guess the question that's always existed in this space is, which patients with what treatments have a better outcome by doing it with this aggressive way versus the less aggressive way, which I would just say is rate control and anticoagulation. And I guess I would say that what I view as the error was in the years prior to AFFIRM, without having really clearly delineated the group of people, and they might be people who develop AFib younger than 55, who have small atria based on whatever imaging you want to use, who have AFib for the first time in their life, who are really symptomatic with that AFib, so you've presented to an emergency room with that AFib, those might be the people who truly do benefit from loading them up with whatever antiarrhythmic class 1, whatever CD, whatever you want, and doing the whatever you want procedure to them. Those might be the people that benefit. But in the years prior to AFFIRM, without having generated that evidence, we didn't know who were the people. People were just doing it kind of willy-nilly. One doctor in Ohio might be giving flecainide to all his patients. One doctor in Kansas might be doing it differently. And one doctor in New York might be rate controlling everybody. And then AFFIRM comes along and says that under these circumstances, which have limitations, we can find no benefit to rate control, rhythm control over rate control. I have no doubt that in some future moment, there'll be some population you could really put a lasso around and say, these are the type of people with characteristics A, B, C, D, and these are the drugs you give them, not, whatever, flecainide and not amio, but you give them whatever the new drugs are. What are your new drugs? Dronedarone and whatever you have, I don't know, whatever your new drugs are. And your new catheters, and that these are the people who benefit. So I guess my worldview would be that the burden is on the people who want to put someone in rhythm to show me who, show me what, and under what circumstances you have a benefit. And in the absence of that, to not blow all our money on flecainide. And then, so then the other side part of it is, why did they use so many antiarrhythmics? I suspect, I haven't looked closely, but I suspect they were detailed by the makers of flecainide and all those drugs, and those were heavily pushed. Some of the early catheter studies I was reading were, back in those days, were like a total disaster. They had high rates of failure. They probably didn't pick the patients that thoughtfully for those catheter ablations. And there are many people I've seen that had like multiple AFib ablations, like, and the doctor believes that like the 7th one will do it, right? It's like, oh my God, the first 6 didn't work and the 7th's gonna do the trick. So I guess that's how I would articulate my view, is that the onus is on the medical profession to justify under what circumstances there is some benefit. But I have no doubt that it's possible that there is such a group.
Let me, can I?
Yes.
Oh yeah.
Can I jump in there in here?
Yeah.
So, Vinay, I'm very happy with what you said early on. I want to sort of develop that earlier. And in general, I think I've come to understand this a little better. But you're one of the 4 knights of medical conservatism, the 4 horsemen of medical conservatism.
Oh, by the way, it's no longer called that. It's called They have another article very similar in JAMA, and it's
Okay.
called like Just Right Medicine or something.
Why
It's
did medical
just out.
conservatism invite too much? The Twitter mob.
Yeah, it actually did. Remember Mandrola? He got in hell of trouble for that.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay,
So,
go on.
but
Yeah,
but
I'm
I
one of the
think
four
I think
horsemen of
your
conservatism.
point is very important, and I think absolutely correct and accurate when you say that for you part of the impetus for your position is this concern about cost and pay. And in
Yes.
the paper on medical conservatism, I think you specifically say that when treatments are either very costly or very onerous in what way, or may have a lot of side effects and whatnot. I mean, this is sort of the focus of your attention, and therefore, um, the two are intertwined. Your position on why it's important to have clinical trials and very
Yes.
solid evidence of that sort of has comes from the fact that that these things cost. So I have two concerns, and they're kind of related. One is that point is actually frequently overlooked because in essence, it is a regulatory point. It's a regulatory position stance. It's about what are we going to approve, what the country should pay for, what the insurance companies should pay for, and whatnot, which is different from a clinical position, right? What's going to help me treat this patient? And I think if and of course, I mean, you could say the two end up being the same in our current world where most of the care is paid by third parties.
Sure.
I agree, but then the problem that I see is my view, and you're right that I'm for people, and it's not that I'm an individualist. I don't like individualism and so forth, but I think people paying out of pocket doesn't mean individually there can be sort of intermediate institutions that are private institutions, charities, churches. I mean, the way it was, sort of somebody's personal entourage and whatnot that can pay for care.
Yes.
And if you do it that way, as opposed to a so-called social contract of taxation and
Yeah.
redistribution, if you do it that way, that's going to take care of the hype, because
Yes, I believe it will too. Yeah. No,
right.
I
So
agree.
so
Yeah.
so the problem of the social contract and taxation and redistribution is that really it invites it invites the bad behavior on the part of the
Yeah.
doctors to do what's more expensive and so forth. It invites hyping. It invites distorting the truth. It invites overselling what you do. It invites disregarding the side effects and the harms and whatnot, because it's going to be it's more work for the doctors and whatnot. So I think it's important, but my main concern, and in a way, I think I've seen you a few months ago give up on the term evidence-based medicine,
I did.
perhaps.
I know.
Okay,
I hate
right,
it.
and
I'll
I'm
tell
very
you why
happy with
about that
that. I'm,
too.
I'm
Yeah.
pleased with that, because evidence-based medicine in people's mind is sort of a clinical position. Is what is it? How is it going to help me take care of this patient?
Yeah.
When in fact, I think your position is more global. Is about how this healthcare system is run and so forth. And
Yes.
yeah,
Well, let me just say a few
go
things
ahead.
because I really like a lot of what you said, and I just think we have slightly different starting positions. But if I accept your starting positions, I see a lot of wisdom in what you say. But let me just say a couple things. Like your first point was like I care about things because they cost a lot, and I would just broaden that a little bit. I guess I would say I care about things based on sort of a few factors, and these are the factors. One is how much the thing costs per unit. One is what's the total budgetary impact of the thing. So I something that's only used 2 units of, even if it costs a lot, I'm not going to spend too much of my time with. Is it invasive or non-invasive? I'm going to prioritize invasive. Are the harms potentially significant? Like IVC filter, because of its strut fracture and things like that, the harms are significant. And then the last thing I'd say is there an ability? Do I believe that you can persuade people about the value of this intervention? Is there sort of an equipoise? I don't want to use that word equipoise, but a sort of a general sort of uncertainty there. And I call this is sort of a value of information framework of what to prioritize. And that's partly why I'm critical of people who spend all their time dunking on cupping and things like that, because it doesn't cost that much and it's not as harmful as other things. And, we're not redistributing money. And I also put that in there. Yeah. Who's
Sure.
paying for it? Individuals. Just one
Yeah.
example
Let
there
me
is, well, let me just give you
go
one
ahead. Go
example.
ahead. Yeah.
Like somebody could buy a statue and put it on their windowsill, and they could say the statue makes me feel better, right? But nobody in healthcare comments about whether or not people buy a statue, because we consider that sort of outside our purview. And to some degree, if people spend their own money on things for their own pursuit of health, who are we to judge? It has to do with the ones that we all pay for. So the next point that you were kind of articulating is this idea that, you know, I think this is where we will disagree a little bit, which is that I believe that we have to, in part because of the success of medicine, some medicines do work wonderfully. And I believe that, and some of them really do cost real money. So, you know, some pills, the real cost of the pill is not the cost that they're billed for, but some procedures like ventilation and ventilators or dialysis that really cost money to run. And it's money that individuals may not always have. So there has to be some sort of collective mechanism to redistribute that money for those services, if you believe those services are part of what it means to live a long and rich life. And I think so that's where we would disagree a little bit. But to your point about is it the case that some of the way I view evidence is contingent on who pays? I would say absolutely, it is the case. Right. And if it was paid in the way you describe, then not only I would just stop doing the kind of research I do, because that question would be gone. It would be like you choosing to buy a statue. I have never done research on statues and whether they improve health, and I could care less. And sure. You know, if you choose to buy it, it's your business. And if I choose not to, that's my business sure. as well. You know?
But fair enough, and that's very good. But let me ask you about one phrase. So you gave up evidence-based medicine, and
yes,
I approve of that. And then, but one phrase that I perhaps you've said it or you continue to say it, and is the question that you can use or you need a clinical trial to show that quote unquote works, you know, whether it's remdesivir or works. And to me, this is a very dangerous phrase, because it's you know, for the reasons that sort of Anish kind of detailed with the AFFIRM trial, caring for, you know, for the patient is very nuanced and blah, blah. And whether something works or not, it doesn't really have much purchase, because you have a patient in front of you that has condition X, and you have a treatment that you wonder about whether it needs, you know, it should be used or not. And the presence of a good clinical trial or its absence doesn't really tell you much about whether it's the right thing to do to use that or not to use that treatment for this given patient.
How would you judge so let's take hypothetical, there's a yellow pill, you decide to give to your patient. How do you judge if it was the right thing to do?
Yeah. So I would use exactly the framework that you elicited. Is it costly? I mean, so again, in my ideal world, it would be, you know, the patient or his or her entourage or personal resources, you know, can they afford it?
We don't need,
is it the harms that I gauge, you know, I may not have the clinical trial of it. So I'm not poo-pooing the clinical trials, but I'm just saying that they're not so essential at the end of the day,
go on.
At all times.
Anish
go ahead. But right, so you know, so the point I was going to make that dovetails nicely into what you just said, Michelle, is that we don't need to come up with a yellow pill and try to figure out, well, what is the effect here, right? What the issue is that there's going to be experienced clinicians that are alive for all those steps of AFFIRM and you know the trials that come after it, to want the freedom and the latitude to practice based on what they feel are these heterogeneous treatment effects, right? So, I mean, a lot of this is like average treatment effect versus, you know, heterogeneous treatment effect in terms of what the clinician feels, and this is where the difference happens, right? Because how do you know that subgroup that you feel based on your experience,
exactly,
you think you have
to take them and randomize them prospectively, then you know,
right? That's what you know for sure. But Vinay, you know, certainly in certain conditions, that there's a cost to that, right? So take one of your take something in your in your field, vemurafenib.
Yes,
that's BRAF
inhibitor.
That was one of the
melanoma was first approved. Yeah,
right. That was one of the first treatments for malignant melanoma, correct? Prior to
okay, fair. It's a good yes. Okay, fair enough.
Meaning until it came on, the treatment paradigm was dacarbazine, right?
Yes.
And so and when this drug came out, it's not that you were coming from a place where, oh, this is some yellow pill and I have no idea what it's going to do. There was a fair amount of data based on a lot of clinicians, correct? A lot of oncologists who were treating folks who were involved in some of the early trial, you know, producing some of the data and, you know, whatever had disseminated in the community, felt that this drug was significantly better than dacarbazine. Yet
at shrinking tumor.
A shrinking tumor. Okay.
A shrinking tumor,
okay.
yes.
But
I guess when we say many people, I would say probably, I would be surprised if it was more than 100 people who had experience with giving that drug. Because before the BRIM-3 study, which is I think what you're coming to, it had not been FDA approved and probably had limited real world use. But fair enough. People gave the drug and it shrunk tumors massively. At least 60% of people tumor shrink.
Right. So there was, yeah, right. So and dacarbazine did not do that at all. I mean, and it's enough,
modestly, yes.
And it's enough that, again, this is not my words. I have no clue about this, but enough that a prominent oncologist said, I can tell you one thing. This is a quote. No one working in the field who had this disease or had a family member with this disease would have allowed himself or his loved one to be randomized to the dacarbazine control arm.
Yeah, that's probably not true. Well, I guess I would disagree with that oncologist's point of view, but go on.
Well, is it the case? And here, we're not living at the time of dacarbazine versus, we have the trial that is now, or maybe not that drug, but some derivative of that drug now.
No, we use it. Right? That's the standard. Yeah, it's one of the standards.
We don't right to use dacarbazine for somebody with multiple myeloma would be malpractice, correct? Or no?
I agree, it would be. But however, after it was malpractice, the FDA allowed it to be used as the control arm of nivolumab. That's one of the examples I use in my book. But I mean, I think you're right. Once it's beaten and there's a survival benefit from vemurafenib or IPI, as there was in another trial, it is no longer allowed to be the control arm in my world. I mean, I agree. It's right. Inferior. Yeah.
So, but here I'll appeal to your progressive nature here.
Yes.
Because the issue is that it is possible to know before. That would be what I would say. It is possible to know before the RCTs happen that.
No, I don't think. That's where I think that's where we disagree a little bit, because let's just talk about the people who got. So this is in retrospect, this is a success.
Right.
Going into it, I think one could have had more uncertainty, because there are drugs with exquisite response rates that shrink tumor. Iodine 131 tositumumab, Bexar, 69% response rate in every randomized trial to date, all negative. It's been pulled off the market voluntarily by GSK. Okay, so just because it has a high 30% or more tumor shrinkage, which is what this drug did, doesn't necessarily mean it lives longer, live better lives. But this drug, which you're talking about, people in the control arm lived on average 6 months. How long did they live when they got this drug? These are 50-year-old people, 60-year-old people. How long did they live when they get this drug?
Yeah, I don't know.
11 months. And so I guess my point is that that's great. In oncology, from like 6 to 11, that's like massive. We like pop champagne, we like celebrate, but we have to have some broad perspective, which is like 6 to 11 months. That's not the way that doctor was describing it. I would have said it would be 6 months to 11 years, that's what we should be talking about. But if not, and I guess the answer is that shrinking the tumor, it's very seductive. When you're a doctor and you give a drug and tumors shrink, you really feel good. But it's not always as durable as you wish. And the whole purpose of the randomization is to separate that flash in the pan from what really improves survival.
But Vinay, on that particular point, I heard, and it may be incorrect, but I think it's correct. The US has the best survival for cancer in general, if you count it from the point of diagnosis, as opposed to other countries. Is that? You laugh at that, or?
Well, I mean, I think that's absolutely true. But one of the things that is a bias there is, for instance, if you diagnose everything sooner, you will artificially inflate that statistic. So, if everyone gets put in an MRI machine tomorrow, our cancer survival will go way up. 5 years survival will go way up. Yeah.
But now to go back to the point, I mean, of whether you need the trial to show that it works or doesn't work. I mean, we just had 2 examples. One, in the AFFIRM trial, if you say that the AFFIRM trial says rhythm control doesn't work, well, as it turns out, there was, conceivably, there's a subset of patients for whom it works. Vice versa.
That's always true, though. And even in positive trials, there's a subset of patients who it doesn't work and who it works even better in.
So right now, I don't use statins, in many people who have a negative coronary calcium scan, and people, without a randomized trial. I mean, there are people who have a coronary calcium scan of 0. And I say, listen, I'm.
So I guess the logic there isn't that it doesn't work. It's that the baseline cardiovascular risk is super low, right? So the absolute risk at most could be low.
Correct. Okay. But the point is that you can make, to take care of a patient, the question is not does it work or does it not work? And the clinical trial will provide an answer, because the clinical trial only provides the answer for a quote unquote like population.
Yes.
And
I guess the clinical trial is asking
different or not.
Yes. Of course.
It's a big leap, right?
Yeah, but I guess I'd say the clinical trial is answering the question of, does this work under some circumstances?
Yeah.
So all the drugs that we approve, like if a drug doesn't work under some circumstances, they're not even approved. So Michelle, there are
Yeah.
many drugs, thousands, tens of thousands of cancer drugs that I cannot prescribe because they're not on the market, because they did not work under any circumstances, that nobody could find a set of circumstances where they worked. In order to get more drugs for people to try, we have changed the bar that drugs have to clear. So now they no longer have to improve survival in randomized trials. They can delay the size of tumors on scans, or they can shrink tumors, and they can do that in settings where we don't scan everybody because we're censoring people. But I mean, I think your point is a good point, which is at the individual level, when you give a drug, unless the drug is for some measurable short-term endpoint that you can visualize, you often don't know whether or not you helped that person. And so medicine inherently, I know you hate it, to some degree, it's always about populations. You know, if you control blood pressure, on average, your patients are going to live longer. But every individual patient you put on a blood pressure pill, 1 in 1,000 could get Steven Johnson's from one of the drugs and actually have a shortened life. So at an individual level, it's very hard to know if we're benefiting a person. But I think the beauty of studies is to know on average we help people.
Right. No, that's fair. But I mean, I think still, I mean, that would be the sort of the mark of the good clinician, is going to be the one who knows.
But we all feel we know, Michelle. I feel I know. I mean, everyone, the good ones and the bad ones, we all are cocksure we know. I mean, we're just so sure.
So correct. And that's why we're so prone to hype and hyping ourselves. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that there's not a difference between good clinicians and bad clinicians.
I agree with you. I agree with you. I wish we could better define that, like what it means. I mean, I've listened to you, and I have a sense you're a good clinician because you're a thoughtful person. You articulate things well.
I think Anish is much better than I am. But
well, I actually have the feeling Anish is a good clinician too. And so despite all our disagreements, I bet your patients think of you as a good doctor because of the way you like to explain things, the way you communicate.
Because, I mean, perhaps at the end of the day, provided that I try not to, just like you, try to take the hype into account, or discount it, or minimize it, or whatnot. Think about it, think about those things. The problem of the cost is impossible for me to solve. It's an impossibility in the current in the system of
me too.
Right? It's impossible. So I do my best. I try to. I mean, they're always individual circumstances that end up influencing my decision more so than the presence or absence of a clinical trial. Right. So,
I'm the same way, Michelle. I guess the only difference is, in my worldview, just because a trial was positive, I may not apply it to my patient. But if there's never been a trial that's positive, I would be extremely reluctant to try that in my patient. I think that's the only way I would articulate it. But I don't want to be wedded to trials, especially when people are older and have many more comorbidities than the trial, and they have different preferences than the people who participate in trials, who are very select people, not like the people you may run into in rural Oregon, for instance. But I agree with you. Doctors will always have to individualize the care. And I agree with Anish also that being a doctor means there must be some broad flexibility in what you're allowed to do. And I think the only things that we are disagreeing about is how much flexibility when you're just running up the tab of tens of billions of dollars that other people are paying.
Right.
That's and I actually, so that's, I think the sort of.
So let me run. I mean,
I know I got to run.
I mean, ask your reaction to how I view clinical trials.
Okay.
I view them, even clinical trials with hard endpoints, mortality endpoints, even those, at the end of the day, I view them as surrogates.
They're surrogates for survival in the real world.
They're surrogates. I mean, it gives you confidence in the drug or not confidence. So it tells you something about the drug or the treatment or intervention that you end up putting into the mix, but it shouldn't either completely disallow you from using the drug or completely compel you.
I agree with you.
Right?
But I wrote a paper called Overall Survival in Cancer Clinical Trials as a surrogate for survival in your practice, in the real world.
Bingo.
Yeah, because just because there's a survival benefit doesn't mean you have to give it to everybody, and especially if they don't look anything like the person in the trial, I think.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So I think, but that's a nuance. Right, and that's the nuance I think that gets lost in the EBM sort of.
Of course, that's part of why I abandoned it. The other part is that people who were present in some meeting in 1990 keep acting like they know what EBM really is because they were at some meeting in 1990. And I was like, if you think that, that's literally the antithesis of this movement. That's just eminence-based. You just want credit because you were there, some meeting in 1990. And so I say, enough of this. It's such a polarizing word. I hate it. I'm done with EBM. There we will agree, but I'm buried it. I call it just medical decision making or better decisions. That's what I'm calling it.
Now, last challenge here, at least for me, is, don't you think? I mean, if you have, having such rigorous demands and bars and whatnot, I mean, doesn't it contribute to the cost? I mean, in a way, isn't it sort of? I mean, it adds to what you're trying to combat to begin with.
I agree. I guess I would say though that part of the problem with bureaucracy, particularly the administrative state, is they see things that are problematic and they create hurdles to jump over that have nothing to do with the problems they've seen. They think that it helps, and they've created so many hurdles to do a randomized trial. The analogy I always use is that running an actual randomized trial in today's America, it's like flying on United Airlines. There's no leg room and it's all cramped. And this is back when we used to fly.
Right.
But just because flying on United Airlines was an awful experience, it doesn't mean the 747 airplane is broken. It's because we added all this bullshit to it, and we have made trials horrible. And all that horrible stuff doesn't actually stop the bad trials. They're still running the bad trials because it's not the right regulation, I think. But I think we'll agree there. It does add to the cost. However, I think that you can have a better regulatory system, I hope.
Well, Vinay, we've taken up a ton of your time, so I really, really appreciate you coming on. Thanks for a fantastic conversation. Hopefully, we can, we could keep going for a while, but and I hope we can maybe have you back to kind of flesh out some of this,
Well, maybe there'll be some news scandal that we will have to live with. But I guess I would say, I commend you both for your discussions. I've enjoyed listening to a bunch of them, and it's important to be able to talk about these things as we have. And even if we part here, I think with different views on these issues, at least we could actually talk about them. And I won't be calling your boss and asking you be fired from your job, et cetera, et cetera.
Alrighty. Vinay, thanks again.
Thank you very much.
We'll see you on Twitter. Oh, Vinay, tell us your Twitter handle is for the folks who are listening.
For the three folks who don't
who don't know it.
At Prasad MDMPH. But I always say, and I don't know if you feel this way, I'm like, don't follow me. I mean, I always see these lists of like who to follow, and it's all just people patting their friends on the back. And then you follow those accounts. They don't have anything interesting to say. Follow people. You go on Twitter and you follow people who say interesting things to you. You don't follow me. You find who you are interested in, and that's how you do it. That's the only good advice. All right. Take care, guys.
All right, sir.
Pleasure.